My name is Jim, and for the last 4 to 5 years, I've been studying pretty hard. Not just the canonized scriptures and going back into the old writings, the Old Testament, and rediscovering there, but also going into what is commonly called such things as the hidden scriptures, the scriptures that were hidden and removed from us, such as Enoch and Jubilees and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, Second Esdras, and other writings as well that are, I think, rather affirmed as real scripture and scripture in the time of Messiah. So I've been studying this, and those studies have led me to at least many positions. But two of the positions that I'm addressing here today is that one of which is that the occupants of the Dead Sea area, what we call today Qumran, the Qumran community, back in the day it would have been called Bethabara in the days of Messiah, so it would be the Bethabaran type community. This area and this compound that exists on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, where the caves were and where they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. Upon that discovery, we've got all of these folks who have been giving us and translating for us over the years, telling us it's the Essenes that occupied, at least in the early days, that the Essenes occupied that land. Well, the position that I take is that it is not the Essenes at all. It is the legitimate priesthood that was deposed under Antiochus in 175 BC that moved to that area, occupied that area, and populated that area, and that they became the minority, a minority in the land of Judea, because when they were deposed by Antiochus, they were replaced with Hellenistic priests that brought to the land of Judea and to the leadership and to the high priesthood of Israel Greek Hellenistic culture and ways and calendars. So what we have in the days of the Dead Sea community, which is the Qumran community, is a minority group of people, the legitimate priesthood that set up in that compound and operated from that compound, which I hold to be the area in the desert and in the wilderness where John the Baptist went to study and learn. And it's the legitimate Hebrew religion. It's the remnant of Israel standing as a minority and juxtaposed against the majority of Israel, now led by the defiled priesthood sitting in the temple. So I hold that the occupants of the Dead Sea is the legitimate priesthood, the occupants of the Dead Sea area. And the other piece that I hold is that there were clearly two calendars that we read about in the gospel accounts when we experience that last week of Messiah's life, and that's made evident in the last day before his crucifixion, because for Messiah, no question, it was his Passover day. It was the day of preparation where they killed the lamb and then ate their Passover meal that night before he went out into the garden and was arrested. And the very next day would have been the 15th for him, and the next day, which would have started at sunrise for him, would have been the 15th. It would have been the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It would have been a Sabbath day for Messiah and the legitimate calendar and the legitimate priesthood. But for the Pharisees, who were keeping a separate calendar, when they brought Yahushua, Jesus, to the palace, they were worried about going inside because they didn't want to be disqualified for the Passover they were getting ready to eat. So in that very moment, Passover had come and gone for Messiah, but it was still on the agenda for the Jews or the Yehudim or the Pharisees, whatever you want to call it, the land of Judea at that time. It was still on the agenda. And they had embraced by that time an evening start of the day, apparently because they're trying to get Messiah off the cross before sunset, when they would be starting their next day. A different approach than what Messiah just went through and experienced. So I've got calendars out there on both of these, videos out there in my channel, in playlists, and I will put links to them. I've got one where I'm covering Rachel Ellier and her presentation. She is a Hebrew scholar and gives a presentation in discussing this. And her focus, I think, is more calendar related than occupant related. But when asked at the end of her presentation if she thought they were Zadokites, she said something along the lines of, well, they sure are referenced an awful lot, and they take credit for an awful lot. I think she was alluding to the idea, coming short of saying, oh yeah, it was the occupants were the legitimate priesthood, the Zadokites. She falls just short of that, but kind of gives evidence for it. And then I've got another video that is actually both that one and the one called John the Baptist, which is dealing with Avi ben Mordecai and some of his work. These are two videos that I've put out there that give details for the occupants and the calendars and the struggles that were out there. And I will attach those in the description of this. You know, if I publish this one, I'll attach these videos to this particular video. And I have another video where I talk about the timelines and the history that we find in Giza Vermes' 1961 translation, where he gives us much information around this time where the Greeks wrested the lands away, Judea, the empire of Persia away. Greek conquered Persia in 322. And then immediately that Greek kingdom split into four, with the Ptolemies to the south operating out of Egypt and the Seleucids operating out of the north. And for the first 120 years or so of the Greek empire, Judea was under the control of the Ptolemies out of Egypt initially, and then ultimately went under the control of the Seleucids from the north. And I'll explain that in a moment. But I want to, just in those studies, it led me to this additional book. And this is one of the many books that that you can obtain if you're trying to discover information about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you have the, here's the Giza Vermes book that came out first in 1961. You know, now it's published by the Penguin Classics. And this one is full of lots of opinions by Giza Vermes, which I don't hold to so many of them because they just don't seem to grasp what the legitimate priesthood was. That was followed by a series of things that came out in the 90s. We have this one that came out, I believe, in 1992 from Florentino Garcia Martinez, called The Dead Sea Scrolls Translated. This is my favorite because he does the least opinionation. There's just less opinion, I think, presented. Some opinion, but lesser so than some of the other books provide us. And then we had the Dead Sea Scrolls that came out. This is a new translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls by this grouping of people. I think that came out in 1996. And then we have this Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, which takes a little bit different approach and includes Robert Eisenman and Michael Wise, who published this. And this is the book I'm going to go into today because that's where I found what I want to share today. But they also have this, Robert Eisenman also produced this Dead Sea Scrolls in the First Christians book. Well, they're all postulating who these occupants are. And I'm going to say that they don't, I cannot follow all of them. I can't follow really any of them because I just think they're not, while they have lots of data on what was happening in and around the lands at that time, they never seem to address what happened in 175 BC and how cataclysmic that is in this discussion, because prior to 175 BC, we had legitimate priesthood sitting in the high priesthood. From 175 BC and forward, we had illegitimate priesthood sitting in the high priesthood. So let me go to the chronology to see if I can quickly, hopefully set the stage for what I'm talking about here. This is Giza Vermes' book and his chronology, and these are the two periods of time that I'm most interested in here, where we are demonstrating that in 197 BC, Judea became a province of the Seleucid Empire, and then the first one on the scene is Seleucus IV. Well, I shouldn't say first, but from 187 to 175, well, he began the Hellenistic infiltration into Judea, which means the bringing of the Greek culture into the into Judea, into the Holy Lands, but it was resisted by the Zadokite high priest Onias III. That's a very important statement, this Zadokite high priest. And then in 175 BC, we see Antiochus Epiphanes wrest control away from Seleucus IV, and he simply deposed Onias III, who was the Zadokite high priest, who was resisting Hellenization, and instead brought his brother Jason, who was a Hellenophile, which means a supporter of the Hellenizing of Judea, even though Jason probably was of the legitimate line, and was, I'm certain, of the legitimate line of the sons of Aaron. He was a Hellenizer. He's, at very best, even if he was of the legitimate priesthood, he began the process of bringing Greek influence into Judea, discounting what needed to be kept in Judea, to keep the true religion, to keep the true Hebrew faith in place, the Torah in place, and the calendar in place. Jason would have begun working against it. But even if that was only nominal, he was deposed just 3 years later and replaced by Menelaus, who wasn't even of the sons of Zadok or the sons of Aaron. Now, this is the critical moment in time. From here on, I believe we see the legitimate priesthood being deposed and replaced by Hellenistic priests. They would begin to leave the temple area, leave Jerusalem, and began accumulating and migrating to Bethabara, which would be the compound on that northwest corner of the Dead Sea that we now call Qumran. So these are the occupants that came to occupy and become known as the community or the way and other things. So I've got videos where I build all of this, including the priesthood, because what you have to understand, and what I think all of these authors that are trying to give us introductions and opinions about what's taking place fail to incorporate and remember that the Elohim appointed priesthood were the sons of Aaron. 2 of those were destroyed right away, and 2 remained. And then at the time of Solomon, the last, the 2 remaining high priesthood lines were consolidated into one because of the rebellion of Abiathar and his execution. So that left us Zadok in the high priesthood. And so Zadok became the sole line through which the high priesthood would come and be appointed. And that's why, even by the time we get to the Second Temple, we see the Zadokites referenced all the time. We get to Ezra, and he's of the Zadokite line, etc. We see the references to this. And in the Dead Sea writings, it comes to, while we lose it in our canonized scriptures, we begin to lose any references to the Zadokite priesthood really outside of Ezra. But when you return to the writings that we find in the Dead Sea that were lost to us, we begin to see the proliferation of the Zadokite priesthood, that line again. Again, I think that is where John the Baptist is of the line of Aaron and would have been qualified to participate in this community. And I think he rose to the role of a priestly leader because he had Talmidim under him by the time he came into the land and baptizing and became known. Okay, so this is the critical time, and this is just supporting what I'm saying. The occupants of the Dead Sea area would have been the Zadokites, the legitimate priesthood, and there are 2 opposing calendars. The calendar, the Hebrew calendar that Onias III and the Zadokites would have been championing, and the replacement calendar that came to and through Judea through the Hellenizing priests and Greece as they were trying to basically, incorporate Judea into their culture and into their empire. So that's a brief and summary background to what I want to read here, which is if you don't understand these things, probably make what I'm sharing here of less value to you, if any value to you. But again, if this piques your interest and this is the first you've seen, then I will put. I've got at least 3 videos I'm going to attach. One of them that develops what the Aaronic priesthood is and who the Zadokites were. One that deals with Rachel Ellier's presentation, and one of them that deals with Avi ben Mordecai's presentation and video account. With that, let me go ahead and read to you what I'm referencing in this book. Forgive me. This one, in the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered. This is chapter 4 of the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered by Robert Eisenman and Michael Wise. And I'm going to go ahead and start with, let me confirm, just in case it's confusing, because calendrical sounds like cylindrical and some other things. Calendrical text and priestly courses, what this means is that these are texts related to the calendar. So they are calendar-based text, and the priestly courses all have to do with the course of how they would serve, that, and this was established in the days of David, how the various priests would take their turns serving in the court, how the various Levites and how they would just set up. And because really we don't get this from our scriptures, from our canonized scriptures, but there had to be organization for them to do this. And we start seeing some of the organizational pieces of how it worked in these Dead Sea Scrolls through the community rules and through some of the other documents and some of the things that they're referencing here. We begin to see how they organized this, which you would never get if you were just limiting yourself to the canonized scriptures. So with that, let's just start from the beginning of this chapter. And I'm going to pretty much read the chapter because I think I need to. And it's not the chapter, I'm sorry, just a few paragraphs of the chapter. But let's go ahead and start here with the first sentence. The calendrical texts from the Qumran K4 are numerous and significant. They comprise 18 texts, 4Q 319 through 330 and 4Q 337. If you're not familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the lettering. I think this is the fourth cave, and then they just label the various text that they have, the scrolls that they have, and this is how they are identifying them. Because you'll get in each of these books, you're going to get different names for the scrolls that they're translating, but here they're just all named the same: 4Q 319, 4Q 330, 4Q 337, etc. Okay, not including many texts which, while not strictly calendrical, presuppose a present calendrical system. The latter category includes the Genesis Florigium in chapter 3 above, and the first letter on works of righteousness in chapter 6, and the Brontologion in chapter 8 below. But here's where it begins to share what I think is of interest here, because they are noting without presupposing that these are the Zadokites and the legitimate priesthood sitting there. They just know that this group is the minority. A minority group. That's all that the authors of this book know. But they make the comment that especially noteworthy is the absence among the Qumran caches of any text advocating a different calendar. So, well, here, let's keep reading here. So this absence is striking because the calendar of the Qumran materials was only one of several in use and seems to have represented a minority position. The calendrical texts are, therefore, central to any attempt to understand the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In order to follow the rather technical expositions of these texts, one must know a few facts about the calendar they advocate and about the priestly courses, which are the mishmarot, which served in the temple in Jerusalem. Well, let me say that you won't find it in what I'm getting ready to read. You'll find some references to it. But the calendar that they see advocated in the Qumran caches is the Enochian calendar, a 364-day calendar that is referenced in Enoch, referenced in Jubilees. It creates a situation, and I think they're going to say here in a moment, where all of the various Moedim will land on the same days. It is the calendar that was given to Enoch. It's the calendar that existed in the days of Moses when he wrote Jubilees, and the calendar referenced throughout Exodus, Leviticus, and the various writings of Moses. But it's important that they are, and I would say they don't say it here, but they say it elsewhere, that the calendar that they were presenting it's a solar-based calendar, which they will say, but it begins with the sunrise each day and not the evening. The evening beginning was part of the other calendars that took over in the land and became the majority positions. It was the sunrise calendar that they were advocating for. So the Qumran caches, when it says that there's an absence of anything in the Qumran caves, it advocated for a different calendar from this, and to be clear, that's from the 364-day Enochian calendar, which is also referenced as the Zadok calendar. Because why are they calling it the Zadok calendar? Because it's the Enochian calendar that the Zadoks, the priesthood, were advocating for. And this is an important statement. The absence is striking because the calendar of Qumran, the Enochian or Zadok calendar, was only one of several in use and represented a minority position. So this is what is suggesting that by the time a couple hundred years later we're getting to the days of Messiah, the majority position had a different calendar than the Zadoks, than the legitimate priesthood. They were operating on a different calendar, and maybe even different calendars had come and gone. Maybe they were operating on multiple calendars in the various lands, but over time we believe, there's evidence, and I think they'll refer to it in this chapter even, that their positions, these the majority calendars would change with time. But the calendar being advocated by the occupants of the Qumran community, this community was constant. It didn't change. It was the Hebrew Enoch or Zadok calendar that did not change. Okay, so in order to follow the rather technical expositions, I guess I already read this, the Mishmarot, which served in the Temple of Jerusalem. Okay, so the calendar is purely solar. So it's not the calendar that this community was advocating for and that I believe Messiah affirmed when he came to, let me just also say, I've presented it. I guess I need to attach a fourth video because I've got another one where I'm talking about the two calendars, because Messiah, when he came into his ministry, he did not go to the priest of the temple in Jerusalem. He came to John, the priest, the legitimate priesthood that was occupying beyond the Jordan and baptizing beyond the Jordan to get his anointing, to get his baptism. So he went to the legitimate priesthood, and I believe he was keeping, this is where you find the true religion out of this grouping of people, this minority grouping, the remnant of Israel, as you will hear me refer to them. That's where you go to get your true religion affirmed by Messiah. And it's a purely solar calendar, meaning it is based upon the sun only and is not lunisolar or lunar in its makeup, meaning it does not bring in the moon into the calculation of the days. The moon has its place in calculating things, but not the days, not the calendar. Okay, so the calendar is purely solar based on a particular understanding of the creation account found in Genesis. And I don't know that this grouping of authors recognizes Enoch, but it's really found much more developed in Enoch. I mean, chapter after chapter after chapter developing this solar calendar that was obviously the basis of the calendar, this 364-day calendar, and Jubilees will also reference it. So you have to go outside of the canonized scriptures to get a better build of what this solar calendar was all about. In its exclusive reliance on the sun, it stands in stark contrast to later rabbinic Judaism. Now, this is what I affirm. Rabbinic Judaism has taken over what we would call Judaism. I mean, if you're gonna, as a Christian, you kind of discount all of it. You don't really think it has anything to do with you. But when you become as a Christian who begins to realize, wait, I belong to Israel, and you begin to realize you need to understand the religion of Israel, and when you in order to walk out your own faith, you need to begin studying and learning the religion of Israel. And what do we do when we begin turning to Torah? we begin turning to Rabbinic Judaism for leadership. That's why everybody's trying to keep an evening to evening day, because they've turned to Rabbinic Judaism to get their lead and to get their explanations of what they're finding in scriptures. Well, Rabbinic Judaism is the error that came out of this period of time. Once Onias was removed and we had all of these Hellenizing priests brought in, this is under this, and then you had the Hasmonean dynasty come forth, the leadership of the here's the Maccabean, the Hasmonean dynasty, the leadership. This is under this leadership and under this grouping of high priests and priesthood that existed in the temple even throughout the days of the Maccabeans. The Maccabeans were heroic in challenging the atrocities of the Greeks, but once they had they arrived at a truce with Greece and then ultimately just stepped into a wrong role. So really, even though we read the book of Maccabees and we see the Maccabees come up and help and become heroes, what followed the book of the Maccabees was illegitimate priesthood led by the Maccabees. So it's a problem. It's just a problem that existed throughout the days of Messiah and the time that this group of people. So this is Rabbinic Judaism began to grow under the tutelage of, from 175 forward, under the tutelage of the Hellenistic priests, then the Hasmonean dynasty, and then the various Sadducees and the Pharisaical systems that arose and had come into place by the time of Messiah. Okay. So let me go back and finish this. So I'm going to start back up here. In its exclusive reliance on the sun, it stands in stark contrast to later Rabbinic Judaism, which followed a lunisolar calendar of 354 days, relying mainly on the moon. Earlier, the Pharisaic forerunners of Rabbinic Judaism seem to have followed an even more lunar-oriented calendar, though from the evidence of the Qumran text, the lunisolar calendar seems already to have gained currency during at least some of the period of the scrolls. So this is the evidential rise of the competing calendar that comes from the Greeks and that were adopted by Judaism as Judea and Judaism, the leadership that was coming out of the land by the time of Messiah. This is the calendar that you would have seen the Pharisees operating under when Messiah was in his last week, in his last days. This is the calendar that the Pharisees were operating under, whereas I believe this calendar up here is the one Messiah was operating under. In the system that finally emerged, going on to continuing to read here, in the system that finally emerged, probably under Greco-Roman influence in Rabbinic Judaism at the end of the 4th century AD, extra lunar months were intercalated, meaning introduced 7 times every 19 years to produce the kind of harmonization necessary to ensure that the calendar remained fixed to the seasons of the solar cycle. And I'll read this, but it's not really germane to my topic here. The Muslims, for their part, reflecting probably in earlier phase of this historical process, never made the complicated mathematical and calendrical intercalations necessary for passage from a lunar to a lunar solar calendar. So, I think of importance here is that you continue to see how Rabbinic Judaism grew it just grew not only from the 175 BC forward, but even into the 4th century BC as they're growing, they're changing their positions in their calendars, etc. Okay, let's continue. By contrast, according to the solar calendar at Qumran, the year always contains precisely 364 days. That's the Enochian calendar. The only question that must be asked is whether that calendar goes back to the Maccabean times. I assert that it predates the Maccabean times and that it precedes the Maccabean times, because I think the calendar would have been removed in and around 175 BC. By the time the Maccabees rose here, 10 years, 12 years later, and then they became the leaders and the high priest 20 years later, the calendar that was in use under the Maccabees would have been the new calendar, the Pharisaic Judaism, the Rabbinic Judaism calendars. So when it asks that question, I would say it predates the Maccabeans. As the third text on the, let's go back and start up here. The only question that must be asked is whether this calendar goes back to Maccabean times, as the third text on the priestly courses implies, or even earlier, which is what I would assert, and whether the Maccabeans themselves preferred it before the Pharisees took over with the rise of Herod once and for all. So this rise of Herod took place to come down here, this is where Herod came on the scene in 37 BC. So this is the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, which would be the Maccabeans, when Herod came on the scene that they're referencing here. And whether the Maccabees preferred it before the Pharisees took over with the rise of Herod. So according to these folks, they're saying that the Pharisees really started rising to power when Herod took over in their political and religious leadership, with Herod coming on the scene in 37 AD. However this may be, the anti-Pharisaic and consequently the anti-Herodian character of the calendar is not to be gainsaid. So what do they mean by this? However this may be, the anti-Pharisaic and consequently the anti-Herodian character of the calendar is not to be gainsaid. So the calendar that you're seeing in the Qumran caves from the Zadokites is anti-Pharisaic, they're saying, and anti-Herodian, which means that they're just not in concert with these calendars. They are in opposition to and give an entirely different accounting of the calendar. And the calendar of the caves, the calendar of the Zadokites, predates the arising of this lunar and lunar solar calendar. All right, last paragraph. Each year consists of 12 months of 30 days each, plus 4 additional days, one of which is intercalated at the end of each 3-month period. So this is exactly what you will read in Enoch. If you will get to the chapters where he's dealing with the solar, the system, the star system, the systems that came about, starting Enoch, I think it was like chapter 72, you will begin to read all about this 360-day year of 30-day months, all of which have at the end of, 4 days, not all of which, but after there are 4 intercalary days, just like they described here, that are intercalated and added at the end of each 3 months. So what I'm really trying to say is you will find this in Enoch. Not just in the calendars of Zadok, because the calendars of the scrolls here reflect the Enochian information they find from the writings of Enoch. Thus, the first and second months are 30 days long, while with its added third day, the third month's total 31 days. Then the pattern repeats. See Table 1. New Year's Day, which is, that's Rosh Hashanah. Don't get the idea that New Year's Day is January 1st of each year. New Year's Day, Rosh Hashanah, was the first day of this particular year, which started in and around the spring equinox, which would be somewhere in the neighborhood of March, for us, March 17, 18, 19, and 20, just depends on the year. And the first day of each 3-month period always falls on a Wednesday, and that's a characteristic that is unique to this calendar and unique to Enoch, unique to Zadok, and that's why we know that if Messiah was keeping this calendar, his Passover would have been kept on the 14th, which would have been a Tuesday, the third day of that week, and that his crucifixion would have taken place on the 15th, which would have been a Wednesday or day 4 of the week. We know, because if that's the calendar he's keeping, then we know what day of each of the week these Moedim would have started. So Wednesday is the day that is mandated as the first day by the creation order, since the heavenly lights, sun, moon, and stars, the basis of any calendar, were created on the 4th day, according to Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19. The great advantage of the Qumran calendar over its lunisolar rival is that it results in fixed dates for the major festivals, which is the Moedim, which is the benefit of it. So, in summary, Well, here, let me finish this paragraph. They cannot fall on a Sabbath, thereby avoiding worrisome difficulties affecting sacrifices. In fact, this calendar guarantees that a particular day of any calendar month will always fall on the same day of every week. So let me just summarize my point here. What I think these are not folks who are necessarily understanding the Zadokite priesthood, the Zadokite role in the legitimate Aaronic priesthood, which I think is foundational to understanding this, and that none of the translators seem to incorporate into their analysis of the things that they're translating. But the evidence is leading them to understand that we have a minority community of people who were keeping a particular calendar, and that particular calendar follows the Enochian calendar. So it's very unique, and it is the traditional Hebrew calendar, very much suggesting that the occupants of this community are the Zadokites, the priesthood, the legitimate priesthood, the remnant of Israel trying to keep Torah according to traditional teaching of Yahweh through or Elohim through the Torah. So it's advocating, without knowing it, it's advocating that the minority position here is the Zadokites. And this is what is standing in contrast to the majority position that had gained traction under the days of the Hellenistic priests and the Hasmonean priests, the Maccabean priests, etc. So the majority calendar that was in place at the time of Messiah would have been this lunar solar calendar. That would have been the majority calendar being operated by the Pharisees at that time, but standing in contrast to the legitimate priesthood minority position and calendar that Yahushua would have been keeping. Which then also, when we get to this second page here, just documents why it's so much different, how we had two separate calendars taking place at the time of Messiah. So what I'm saying is that this passage helps and confirms that the identity of the occupants of the Dead Sea area were the legitimate priesthood, the Zadokite priesthood, and that they were keeping a separate, the true calendar, and it would have been in place by the legitimate and true people during the days of Messiah, which included Messiah, and standing in opposition to a second calendar that existed, but in the majority position led by the Pharisees. Well, thank you, and may you be Baruch.